Okay, class. So, good day sa inyo and thank you for attending the lecture. For this meeting class, we're going to tackle the second to the last lesson for the prelim, your lesson for hemoglobin. So, let's start. Now, hemoglobin class is an iron-bearing protein, a respiratory protein which would serve as the main component of the RBC. Now, this is called class an iron-bearing protein because it could contain the ferrous form or the ferrous iron inside it, inside the hemoglobin. Again, this is called an iron bearing protein because it contains the ferrous iron inside the hemoglobin. Now, this is also considered a respiratory protein class. Why? Because it carries oxygen and carbon dioxide, which, as I've discussed in the previous lesson, it carries oxygen from the lungs to the tissue, and from the tissue, and carbon dioxide is carried from the tissue to the lungs. Now, it accounts for 85 to 90% of the total RBC content. So, imagine that, class. It has a very wide percentage of your RBC content, almost 85 to 90%. Now, it would also serve as a vehicle of transport of oxygen from the lungs to the tissue and carbon dioxide from the tissue to the lungs. Now, in the tissue class, hemoglobin has around 20 millimeter mercury of tension force, meaning, class, it only combines with 30% oxygen. So, if you have a low tension force, class, meaning only only a small amount of oxygen could enter the RBC. Later, I will explain that. Again, it has only in the tissue class, hemoglobin has around 20 millimeter mercury tension force. Thus, it would only combine with 30% oxygen. Meaning, class, the lesser the tension force, the smaller the amount of oxygen able to combine or enter the hemoglobin. Now, in the lungs naman, class, hemoglobin has around 100 millimeter mercury of tension force. Thus, your hemoglobin is saturated, meaning punong-puno. It is full of oxygen with about 95%. So, the greater the tension force, the more oxygen it can combine. Now, about 90% of the total body iron class is found in hemoglobin, while 10% would be found in plasma and in tissue. Now, here are some words or terms you need to remember. Number one is ferritin. Ferritin is the storage form of iron. Transferrin naman, class, is the protein that transports iron. The molecular weight of hemoglobin is 64,500 daltons. So please copy. Okay, let's continue. Now, here are the hemoglobin functions, class. It would transport oxygen from the lungs to the tissue and carbon dioxide from the tissue to the lungs. It would assist in acid-base regulation by its buffer action, specifically the carbonate bicarbonate buffer system. Buffer system of the body would be it would control the pH of the blood at 7.45. If the pH of the blood class is greater than 7.45, it is considered alkalosis. But if it is lesser than 7.45, it is known as acidosis. Now, when we talk about acid-base balance class, we have what you call the metabolic acidosis and alkalosis. And we have what you call the respiratory acidosis and alkalosis. Now, this will be tackled class in your clinical chemistry. I won't delve much onto it kasi mapapahaba tayo kasi it's just gonna include also your partial pressure of oxygen, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and so on. So, meron pa yung bicarbonate levels. May mga computation yan. So, I won't tackle much onto it. Basta i-discuss yan sa clinical chemistry niyo. I believe it's on CC2. So, next sem pa. But one of these days, I believe we will be tackling. Sige, I'll give you a brief background on that in the coming weeks na lang. Siguro sa midterms niyo or sa finals. So, please copy. Okay, let's continue. Now, your hemoglobin structure class is composed of the following. Number one, it is composed of 4 globin chains. Now, ano ba tong globin chains na to? If you still remember class, di ba meron tayong variations? We have variations of your globin chains. Kapag embryonic ka, you have different types. Yung Gower 1, Gower 2, Portland. Then, we also have your fetal hemoglobin. Now, in most examples of hemoglobin structure, ang ginagamit nilang hemoglobin to explain the globin chains is yung inyong adult hemoglobin, which is composed of 2 alpha globin chains and 2 beta globin chains. Kaya sinatinawag na 4 globin chains class because in the adult hemoglobin, it is composed of 2 alpha and 2 beta. 2 beta globin chains. So ganun siya. Then it consists of 4 protoporphyrin 9. Now the protoporphyrin 9 is the nitrogenous part. Now it serves as a form of backbone class. A circular backbone. Bakit siya tinawag na backbone? Because class, in the center of the protoporphyrin, you can find the ferrous iron. You can find the ferrous iron. So, ito yan, itong circular na yan class. Now, this is the protoporphyrin. In the middle of the protoporphyrin class is your ferrous iron, also known as yung inyong Heme. Now, protoporphyrin class, please remember this, each globin chain has one corresponding protoporphyrin ring. Meaning class, Kung apat ang inyong globin chain, apat din ang protoporphyrin ring nyo. And kung apat ang protoporphyrin ring nyo, apat din ang ferrous iron nyo. Ulitin ko, class. Your hemoglobin is composed of 4 globin chains. Now, each globin chain, class, has one protoporphyrin ring. Inside the protoporphyrin ring, there is always one molecule of ferrous iron. Now, kung apat ang globin chain mo, if you have 4 globin chains, you also have 4 protoporphyrin ring. And if you have 4 protoporphyrin ring, you also have 4 ferrous iron molecules. So please remember that. Then it also has one T23-DPG synthesized in the Rappaport-Lewis-Bering pathway. Now, ano ba itong 23-DPG na to, class? Itong 23-DPG nyo, class, is important. This is important for oxygen binding. Mamaya i-explain ko kung bakit. Now, iron is maintained in the ferrous form by the enzyme methemoglobin cytochrome C reductase. Now, if naalala nyo pa yung methemoglobin pathway natin, that's how your iron is maintained in the ferrous form. Now, 2,3-DPG regulates the affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen. If inside, hemoglobin cannot combine with oxygen. So, meaning, class, kapag daw, kunwari ito yung 2,3-DPG nyo, gawin nating diamond. Kunwari nasa loob yan, class. If it's inside, your oxygen cannot combine or your oxygen cannot enter the hemoglobin. Meaning, class, kapag hindi maka-enter ang oxygen, it has low affinity. Hindi siya makabind. So, please copy. Okay, let's continue. Now, heme form, class. Now, heme is formed when ferrochelatase aids the ferrous iron to be inserted into the protoporphyrin 9. Now, heme is located near the surface of the molecule, so it can reversibly combine with one hemoglobin molecule, where 4 oxygen molecules can combine with it. Now, the 2,3-DPG regulates the affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen. If 2,3-DPG is inside the hemoglobin molecule, it cannot be combined with oxygen. If outside the molecule, it can readily take up oxygen. Okay, to explain this, class, sa hemoglobin nyo, when it comes to the oxygen binding capacity or oxygen capability, there are two forms. Oxygen capability or oxygen binding capability. There are two forms. Number one, class, is yung tinatawag nating TAUT. T-A-U-T, or in English, ang tawag dyan is tense form. Now, sa tense form, class, the 2,3-DPG, yung 2,3-DPG nyo, is inside the hemoglobin. Meaning, you have low affinity with oxygen. Now, ano ba tong ibig sabihin ng low affinity na to, sir? Basically, class, oxygen cannot enter the hemoglobin. Meaning class, mababa. This has a decreased oxygen content. The oxygen content ng inyong RBC. And this is usually seen class in the tissues. Yung sinasabi ko kanina na if you have low tension force, only 30% of oxygen could combine. So yan yung taut or tense form. 2,3-DPG is inside the hemoglobin. Low affinity with oxygen. Oxygen cannot enter the hemoglobin. Decreased oxygen content in the RBCs and is usually found in the tissue. So please copy. May isang form pa but please copy nyo muna tong taut or yung tense bago ako mag-proceed dun sa second form. So please copy. Okay, let's continue class to the second part or the second form. The second form class is also known as your relax form. Now sa relax form class, 2,3-DPG is outside the hemoglobin. Meaning class oxygen can enter the hemoglobin. And when that happens class, it has high affinity. Meaning class malakas yung intake ng oxygen. High affinity class, this is highly saturated. Highly saturated with oxygen. Meaning punong-puno siya ng oxygen class. And this would occur in the lungs. So that's the relaxed form. 2,3-DPG is outside the hemoglobin. Oxygen can enter the hemoglobin. High affinity, meaning very saturated with oxygen. And this would occur in the lungs. So please copy. Okay, let's continue. Let's talk about class the so-called oxygen dissociation curve. Now, we have the so-called shift to the left, shift to the right, and the normal curve. Now, for you to understand this, ipapaintindi ko muna sa inyo kung ano yung normal curve class. Now, a normal curve class it has a partial oxygen between 20 to 60 millimeter mercury. Okay. If you take a look at this table, ito yung y-axis. Ito yung x. Now, the y-axis here would contain the oxygen saturation or the hemoglobin saturation. Well, at the bottom would be the partial pressure of oxygen or yung tinatawag nating tension force. Now, habi kanina class, if you have lesser tension force, the fewer the oxygen it could carry. Which is totoo naman. Kung zero ang tension force mo or yung partial pressure mo, supposedly dapat zero lang din yung ano mo or mababa yung curve mo. And same with goes that kapag mataas din yung tension force mo, mataas din dapat ang inyong oxygen level or so the theory would go. Now, in a normal curve class, partial oxygen is between 20 to 60 millimeter mercury. Increase affinity class but oxygen can be readily released. Now, before I explain this, you need to understand something. Kapag you encounter the word increase affinity, this would refer class to increase uptake. Meaning, mataas yung or malakas yung pagkuha niya, yung pag-uptake niya class. But not all the times, kaya niya rin itong i-release. Kaya siya meron ditong statement, uh, but oxygen can be released rapidly. Kasi class, not all the times na porkit increase ang affinity mo, you can easily release oxygen. In the case of 20 to 60 millimeter mercury, you have an increased uptake, but you can also rapidly release oxygen. Parang sa relasyon class, I'll give an example. Like let's say, you're the type of person na clingy ka. Clingy ka, but at the same time, kaya mo rin maging neutral or maging normal or kaya mo ring mag-stop sa pagiging clingy mo or high affinity. Now again, kapag ang partial pressure of oxygen mo is between 20 to 60 millimeter mercury, there is increased affinity with oxygen. But oxygen can be released rapidly. Now, bakit to importante class? Remember, if you have increased affinity with oxygen, you can easily transport or carry oxygen to tissues. Kasi nga, puno ka ng oxygen. Puno ng oxygen yung red blood cell mo. So, no problem. Now, it could also be released rapidly. Meaning, class, hindi siya masyadong attached. It's not too attached to the hemoglobin. Meaning, class, it can be readily used in the tissues. So, ulitin ko class, if there is increased oxygen, it simply means that your oxygen can easily be transported to the tissues. Meaning your oxygen is full of, or your hemoglobin is full of oxygen. Now, when you say oxygen can be released rapidly, oxygen, once it arrives at the tissue, it can be immediately utilized. So that's that. Now, a partial oxygen pressure of 20 millimeter, less than 20 millimeter mercury, has a very low affinity for oxygen. Now, when you say a very low affinity to oxygen class, basically, you have no oxygen. You have no oxygen in the RBC or in the hemoglobin. Now, another one, if it's greater than 60 millimeter mercury, it is highly saturated with oxygen saturation. And this would usually occur in the alveoli of the lungs. Now, punta na tayo dun sa tinatawag nilang shift to the left, shift to the right. So, burahin ko muna to ha. Yung shift to the left na yung class, hemoglobin has an increased affinity with oxygen and does not readily release it to the tissues. Now, when it has an increased affinity with oxygen class, meaning it is very saturated with oxygen. Therefore, ang partial oxygen pressure mo would be greater than 60 millimeter mercury. That's where the word to shift to the left would come, class. Kasi it would tend to shift to the left, papunta sa left yung inyong oxygen saturation. Very high, class. Very high ang inyong oxygen saturation. Papunta siya to the left. Papunta yung curve mo to the left side. Then a shift to the right, class, is a decreased affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen. Meaning, class, you have a low oxygen saturation. Mababa ang oxygen saturation mo. But as the tension force increases, as the tension force or the partial oxygen pressure, also known as the partial pressure, increases, mababa pa rin ang oxygen saturation nyo. Therefore, it would now move to the right. Ulitin ko, class, as the partial pressure increases, it will still continue to have a low oxygen saturation, therefore giving it a shift to the right affinity. So I hope that explains it. Now, ang left shift nyo, class, is caused by decreased body temp, decreased 2,3-DPG, decreased hydrogen ions, and carbon dioxide. While right shift naman, class, is caused by increased temperature, increased 2,3-DPG, and increased hydrogen ions. And another thing you need to remember here is that ang right shift nyo would be caused by decreased pH, meaning acidic blood class. Kapag acidic ang blood mo. Then left shift naman siya, class, this would occur kapag increase ang pH, meaning meron kang alkalosis or your blood is alkaline. So please copy. Okay, let's continue. Now, let's talk about the physiologic forms of hemoglobin. You have yung inyong oxyhemoglobin. Hemoglobin in combination with oxygen. It gives pinkness to the skin and the mucous membrane. While the non-oxygenated or reduced hemoglobin, hemoglobin unassociated with oxygen, gives blueness to the skin and mucous membrane. So, yan ang normal physiologic form ng inyong hemoglobin. So, please copy. Okay, let's continue. Hemoglobin metabolism class. Now, synthesis of hemoglobin class. Now, this is composed of heme and globin. Now, heme synthesis. This would occur in most red cells of the body, except the mature RBC, but more abundantly in the erythroid precursor. So, sige nga, let's have a review. I'll give you 1 minute to answer this. Type it in the chat box. At what stage, anong stage class does hemoglobin synthesis begin? So please answer. I'll give you 1 minute. Type it in the chat box. Okay. Dito class, ang answer dun sa tanong na yun is the polychromatophilic polychromatophilic normoblast. This is also known as your rubric. Okay, let's continue. Now, globin synthesis class would occur in the cytoplasm of the erythroblast and reticulocyte. Now, there's what we call hemoglobinization. Hemoglobin is synthesized by young erythroblasts from the polychromatophilic, nandun na pala yung sagot. So it would start from the polychromatophilic normoblasts up to the reticulocyte stage. Now, mature RBC would contain 3 million molecules of hemoglobin. 600 grams of hemoglobin is capable of combining with 800 ml of oxygen. 1 gram of hemoglobin can combine with 1.34 ml of oxygen. Class, please remember that. Baka itanong yan sa quiz nyo or sa exam. Mamaya itanong ko dyan, class. How many ml of oxygen are there in 1,500 grams of hemoglobin? So, sige nga, kayo sumagot. I'll give you 1 minute. Okay, so the answer for this is 1,500 grams. Oh, sorry, 1,500 grams. Natang na ako, class. The answer for this class would be 2,000 ml of oxygen are there in 1.5 grams of hemoglobin. Now, 1 gram of hemoglobin can combine with 1.34 ml of oxygen. So, tandaan nyo lang yung conversion nila. Sige, copy. Okay. Now, to discuss your heme synthesis class, this would occur in the, what you call the cell. Kaya pangit yung pen ko. Ito, green one. So, this would occur class in the cell. Now, in the cell, specifically the cytosol, or yung cytoplasm and the mitochondria. So, this would all begin class within the mitochondria. So, kunwari ito yung mitochondria. Now, in the mitochondria class, there is the presence of what we call your succinyl. Succinyl coenzyme A, CoA. Succinyl CoA. And there is also your glycine. Now, in cases wherein there would be the secretion of the enzyme class, what we call the enzyme ALA, ALA synthase. Now, ano ba tong ALA synthase na to? Now, ALA synthase class would be secreted or would be produced in cases of alcoholism, barbiturates, and the most common reason bakit tayo nagkakaroon ng heme synthesis, yung hypoxia. So when your body detects alcoholism, barbiturates, use of barbiturates, hypoxia, it would cause the secretion of ALA synthesis. Now, there would also be a decrease naman class. Magdi-decrease naman tong ALA synthesis na to. This would happen class if there is already the presence, of heme, if it detects the presence of heme. So magdi-decrease yung ALA synthase. So ulitin ko, in the mitochondria class, we have your succinyl coenzyme A and glycine. Now, an enzyme known as your alanine synthase or your ALA synthase would be produced or secreted if the body detects alcoholism, use of barbiturates, and hypoxia. Now, ALA synthase class would decrease. Magdi-decrease yan class if the body or it detects heme. Now, from the mitochondria class, itong succinyl CoA enzyme A and glycine will be converted by ALA synthase to what we call the amino levulinic acid. Now, itong amino levulinic acid na to, also known as your ALA na to, would become porphobilinogen. Porphobilinogen. Through the use of the enzyme, through the presence of the enzyme, alanine dehydratase. Then si porphobilinogen yung class would become uro. Ito lang nangyayari na to class sa cytosol ha. Sa cytoplasm. Yung porphobilinogen nyo would now become uroporphyrinogen 1 by the enzyme uro 4P. uroporphyrinogen, uroporphyrinogen 1 synthase. Kapag naging porphyrinogen 1 na siya, this would be further converted into uroporphyrinogen 3 by the enzyme, this time, same lang din yung pangalan class, uroporphyrinogen 3 synthase. So, nagkaroon ng word na synthase. Then, uroporphyrinogen 3 class would be converted into your coproporphyrinogen 3. This time by the enzyme, this would be converted by the enzyme uroporphyrinogen decarboxylase. So once it becomes coproporphyrinogen 3 by the enzyme uroporphyrinogen decarboxylase, this coproporphyrinogen 3 would be converted into your protoporphyrinogen 9 by the enzyme coproporphyrinogen oxidase. And itong coproporphyrinogen nyo class, ay yung protoporphyrinogen 9 nyo, would now become the protoporphyrin ring. It would now become the protoporphyrin 9, which would now attach or now form yung heme molecule. And when it detects the heme molecule, i-stop niya or i-decrease niya yung pag-create ng ALA synthesis. Now, stopping the heme synthesis pathway. Okay? So, ulitin natin class. Ang ganda talaga ng sulat ni sir. Okay? So, ulitin natin class. I'm sorry Sorry na. Ulitin natin. So, heme synthesis pathway would occur in the cytosol and the mitochondria. So from the mitochondria class, it would start with the presence of your succinyl coenzyme A and your glycine. Now, when your body detects alcoholism, use of barbiturates, hypoxia, it would start producing the enzyme alanine synthase. Now, alanine synthase class is regulated or upregulated by these three. And de-decrease din siya or ma-minimize due to the presence of yung heme. Now, kapag nakapag-detect siya ng heme. Now, what happens is that yung succinyl coenzyme A and your glycine would be converted by alanine synthase to become your aminolevulinic acid, also known as your ALA. Now, si ALA nyo class would be converted to porphobilinogen by the enzyme. Lagyan natin ng mark para maano. Yung kulay blue, yun yung enzyme. By the enzyme alanine dehydratase. DEHYDRATASE. It would convert aminolevulinic acid to porphobilinogen. Now, kapag porphobilinogen na siya class, it would now be converted to uroporphyrinogen 1 by the enzyme uroporphyrinogen 1 synthase. Kapag uroporphyrinogen 1 na siya, it would again be converted into uroporphyrinogen 3 by the enzyme uroporphyrinogen 3 synthase. And once it is a uroporphyrinogen 3, it would be converted to coproporphyrinogen 3 by the enzyme uroporphyrinogen decarboxylase. So, ito yung enzyme. Now, Si coproporphyrinogen 3 nyo would be converted class to protoporphyrinogen 9 by the enzyme coproporphyrinogen oxidase. Oxidase. And si protoporphyrinogen 9 would now become your protoporphyrin. Dito sa step na to class, itong coproporphyrinogen to protoporphyrinogen, from the cytosol, babalik na naman siya ulit sa mitochondria. So protoporphyrinogen 9 would become your protoporphyrin 9 and it would now form the heme molecule. And kapag na-detect yun, it would cause the decrease in the creation of your alanine synthase. So, ayan siya. So, please, kaya class, pag face-to-face, ayoko nagsusulat sa blackboard. Pag nagsusulat ako ng blackboard, baka siguro baka mag-walk out estudyante ko. Anyway, so let's continue. Now, let's talk about the normal hemoglobin class. So the first one would be your embryonic hemoglobin. This is found in the normal human embryo and fetuses less than 3 months old. They are absent at birth. We have your Gower 1, composed of 2 zeta and 2 epsilon globin chain. We have your Gower 2, 2 alpha and 2 epsilon globin chain. And hemoglobin Portland, 2 zeta and 2 gamma globin chains. Then we have your fetal hemoglobin. Fetal hemoglobin class is the major hemoglobin of fetuses and newborn. This is composed of 2 alpha and 2 gamma globin chain. This is produced 4 months after consumption. Then adult hemoglobin, 95 to 97% of hemoglobin in normal adults. They are produced 1 year and onwards. They are composed of 2 alpha and 2 beta globin chains. Now, if you still remember class, ang inyong mga naalala niyo yung mga ano ng proteins, yung four structures. Yung primary, yung quaternary, yung secondary, yung mga tertiary gano'n. Now, sa inyong sa inyong if you still remember yung primary nyo. These are composed class of your amino acids. Now, ang inyong mga globin chains class is a type of primary protein. Now, the primary protein nyo is composed of amino acids. Now, ang alpha globin chain nyo, please remember this, they are composed of 141 amino acids. While your beta globin chains are composed of 146 amino acid. Now, the normal hemoglobin molecule would appear ellipsoidal with 4 heme groups on the surface. So, please copy. Okay, let's continue. Now, there's another type of hemoglobin class known as your glycosylated hemoglobin. Now, this is very important class. Now, why? Your glycosylated hemoglobin is 5% of your adult hemoglobin. They are produced when adult hemoglobin undergoes linkage of sugars to serine, asparagine, and hydroxylysine residues. Now, yung mga amino acid chains nyo, when they connect these amino acids, itong serine, itong asparagine, itong hydroxylin residues, that would create your glycosylated hemoglobin. Now, they are designated as HbA1a, which is less than 1%, HbA1b, less than 2%, and yung pinaka-importante class, yung HbA1c. So again, yung glycosylated hemoglobin nyo is known as HbA1a, less than 1%, HbA1b, less than 2%, and HbA1c over the 120-day lifespan of RBC. Now, the thing you need to remember here, class, when you talk about glycosylated hemoglobin, ang laging ginagamit na shortcut niyan is ito, HbA1c. Yan lagi ang inaano nila, ginagamit nila. Because itong 1A, 1B is in very small amounts. Now, si HbA1c nyo, class, is a marker on RBC for testing diabetes mellitus. This is used as an index of metabolic control of diabetes during the last 2 to 3 months. When you say index of metabolic control, class, basically it measures the body's metabolism or yung use of sugar in the body. Is it properly metabolized? Na-metabolize ba siya? Nare-remove ba siya properly sa body? Or is it not metabolized? Now, kapag mataas, class, if you have an increase HbA1c, you are considered diabetic. Kaya ang isa pang test, class, aside from your fasting blood sugar, another test used to confirm diabetes mellitus is itong test na to, HbA1c, or your glycosylated hemoglobin. And it would monitor, please remember this, the last 2 to 3 months. Bakit last 2 to 3 months? Remember, they are found in the RBCs. And ang lifespan ng RBC nyo is 120 days. So basically, nakikita niya or nagiging test siya, class, to monitor the sugar use for the last 120 days. Yun ang maganda sa kanya. So, halimbawa, were you already diabetic? Halimbawa, nagpa-test ka ng HbA1c ngayon, September. Tapos, mga bandang July, diabetic ka na pala. Doon pa lang, class, mataas na kagad yung inyong HbA1c. So, ito ang mga normal values niya. It is normal, class, if it is less than 5.70%. You are considered pre-diabetic. When you say pre-diabetic, class, ito yung mga borderline. Meaning, class, pag borderline ka, kaya pang ma-reverse. Meaning, hindi ka pa talaga diabetic. Kasi pag diabetic ka na, very hard to treat na, or very hard to reverse na. So, you can reverse this by exercise, diet, ganun. Then, we have yung diabetes. If you have a value of 6.50% and above. Ang unit ng HbA1c nyo, class, is percent, ha? And I took this reference value from the American Diabetes Association. Ito yung recommended values nila. Then another type of hemoglobin is yung HbA2. It constitutes 1.5 to 3.5% of total hemoglobin, composed of 2 alpha and 2 delta chain. Then we have your HbA3. This is the degradation product of A2, composed of 2 alpha and 2 delta chains. So, tandaan nyo na. Ang A2 nyo, kung ang hemoglobin A nyo is composed of 2 alpha, 2 beta, ang A2 and A3 nyo is composed of alpha and delta chain. So, please copy. Okay, let's continue. Now, let's go naman class to the abnormal hemoglobin. Now, the abnormal hemoglobin class is meron tayong tinatawag na hemoglobin S. Now, hemoglobin S, if you notice that meron siya diyang tinatawag na alpha 2, beta 2, 6-valine. Now, kaya siya tinawag na alpha 2, beta 2 class because that would refer to the globin chain. Yan yung globin chain niya. Therefore, if it's alpha 2, beta 2, ang hemoglobin nyo is an abnormal. This is considered as an abnormal adult hemoglobin. Now, this is, mamaya ko explain yung 6-valine na yan, kung ano ba yan. It causes sickling of the RBC due to reduced oxygen concentration. Now, when you say sickling class, alam niyo yung pangtabas class ng ano? Pangtabas ng palay. Di ba, ano yun, ganyan, ganyan yun. Ganyan. Yung parang ano ng Grim Reaper. So, yan yung pantabas. Pasensya na sa drawing. So, it causes the sickling, parang crescent moon appearance. So, from a discoid shape ng RBC nyo, magiging crescent shape yung RBC, magiging ganyan yan. Parang, yan. This is due to reduced oxygen concentration. Now, they are common among the black race class. So, sa mga Africans, African American, basta may lahi ka ng negro. Now, what happens here, class, ganito yung nangyari dyan. Remember, di ba ang mga hemoglobin nyo, yung globin part, is composed of amino acid chain. Mga amino acid chain yan. Now, here, class, there would be the replacement of glutamic acid into valine on the 6th position of the beta chain. So, kunwari ito yung beta chain nyo, class. Ayan yung mga amino acid. Yung 6th position daw, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Ito daw, class, was originally glutamic acid. But what happens is that there is a mutation. Nagkaroon ng mutation, specifically yung tinatawag, sorry. So, the missense mutation. Oh, tama nga, class. Missense mutation yan. Kasi yung nonsense, magkakaroon ng stop codon. So, in the missense mutation class, glutamic acid would now be replaced. Papalitan siya ngayon ng valine. Okay? So, again, hemoglobin S class is caused by the replacement of glutamic acid to become valine in the 6th position of the beta chain. Now, meron tayong tinatawag na homozygous and heterozygous. If you still remember, sa homozygous nyo is that they're represented by 2 big letters. Kapag heterozygous class, it is represented by a single big letter and 1 small letter. So, in this case, homozygous is represented by a HB, hemoglobin SS. Small b lang yan lagi, class, ha? While the heterozygous is represented by HbAs. Bakit? You may be wondering bakit A. Kasi remember, di ba, this is an abnormal adult hemoglobin. Now, yung homozygous nyo, class, would cause the sickle cell anemia, while the AS would cause the sickle cell trait. And as in all diseases, class, of genetics, di ba, ang pinakamalala dyan is always the homozygous state. So, the one that is deadly, the one with the most symptoms is yung homozygous state. Now, ganito nangyari sa hemoglobin S nyo. The oxygenation would lead to the sickling of cells, including acidity and increase 2,3-DPG. Now, in homozygous, sickling happens when oxygen saturation reaches less than 85%. So, ang homozygous, ano nyo daw, class? Homozygous hemoglobin S nyo. This would happen when the oxygen saturation reaches less than 85%. While in heterozygous, if it reaches less than 40%. Now, sickling would cause pain known as your vasoocclusion. Now, when you say vasoocclusion class, yung mga veins nyo would suddenly collapse or tawag dito, what's the proper term? Obstructed yun ang term. It would be obstructed. It would be obstructed. Hindi makadalo yung blood nyo. And oxygenation could lead to normalization of shape of trypanocyte, but repeated cycle could lead to hemolysis due to damage. Okay. Ito class, dito sa second statement na to. It just means class that your hemoglobin S is reversible. Meaning, pwede siyang ma-normalize. How? You could normalize the hemoglobin S by having the proper oxygenation levels. Etong drepanocyte na to, this is the other name. This is the other name of your sickle cell. Tawag sa mga sickle cell class is yung drepanocyte. Now, but repeated oxygenation could lead to hemolysis due to damage. Now, it is usually symptom-free in the first 6 months of life due to fetal hemoglobin. And again, di ba nga, this is related lang sa adult hemoglobin nyo. Wala siyang kinalaman kung fetus yan, embryonic. Hindi pa yan mag-show ng symptoms. But once it turns adult, naging adult na yung hemoglobin niya, and it would be converted to HbS, it would now be susceptible to hemolysis, producing hemolytic anemia and prominent splenomegaly. It can also produce crisis pain, which is mostly associated with respiratory tract infection and may progress to autosplenectomy. Death is usually due to infection. Now, there are two forms of hemoglobin S via the electrophoresis. So, sa electrophoresis class, 80 to 95% of our HbS, 0 to 20% is fetal hemoglobin, and it would have a normal amount of HbA2. Now, the test for sickle cell class is your sickle cell solubility test. You're going to use the reagent. Ang reagent nyo dito class is saponin and dithionite. Hemoglobin S would be lysed by saponin, and dithionite would convert the ferrous to ferric iron. Hemoglobin S in reduced state would form liquid crystal and would form turbidity. Itong reduced state na tuklasin yung ferric iron. So again, sa sickle solubility test nyo, ang reagents nyo are saponin and dithionite. Si saponin would be for lysis. Si dithionite would convert the ferrous to the ferric hemoglobin. In reduced state, it would form the liquid crystal and would form turbidity. Now, it would cause false positive in hyperlipidemia and if there's too much blood. False negative in infants less than 6 months and low hematocrit. Then another test here, class, is yung sodium metabisulfite test. This is the formation of sickle-shaped cells due to reducing action of metabisulfite. So please copy. Okay, let's continue. Another one class is yung hemoglobin C. So hemoglobin C is also your alpha 2 beta 2. So again, this is an abnormal adult hemoglobin. This time class, it would convert lysine, so glutamic acid, so six position class. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this is your glutamic acid. It would now become lysine. So kanina sa hemoglobin S, valine. Sa hemoglobin C naman, ang pinalit is lysine. So they are also found in the black race, substitution of glutamic acid by lysine in the sixth position of the beta chain. Now, in hemoglobin C class, you will find target cells. Now, target cells look like this. Bilog na merong parang target sa gitna. And you would also see hemoglobin C crystals. They are often in combination with hemoglobin C. Now, later, I will explain kung ano ba yung mga hemoglobin C crystals na yan, kung anong itsura nila. So, please copy. Okay, let's continue. These are other abnormal hemoglobins class. We have your hemoglobin D, composed of several variants. Most frequent variant is the hemoglobin D Punjab and hemoglobin Los Angeles. Now, they were named Punjab in Los Angeles class because they were found in Punjab, India, and Los Angeles, US. Has the same electrophoretic mobility as hemoglobin S, but no sickle cells are observed. Hemoglobin E naman class has the same electrophoretic mobility as A2 and is sometimes associated with thalassemia. Kaya pag nakita mo yan class, kunwari ito yung A2 mo, usually magkalinya sila. They have the same location, magkatabi madalas, or hindi magkatabi, nag-overlap sila. So madali mo makagad malalaman na kapag yung A2 nyo may katabi na ano, it's most likely hemoglobin E. Same with your hemoglobin D class. Kapag yung hemoglobin D nyo may katabihan or kaparallel niya, it's most likely hemoglobin S. Now, this hemoglobin E class is the most common hemoglobinopathy in the Philippines. Associated din siya sa thalassemia. What are thalassemia class? These are the globin abnormalities. I-discuss natin yan. Don't worry. Yeah. Then we have your hemoglobin H. They consist of 4 beta chains. They are associated with alpha chain disease and thalassemia minor. Then we have your Bart's hemoglobin. So sa Bart's class, this is an abnormal variant of the fetal hemoglobin. 4 gamma chains. Di ba dapat 2 alpha yon, 2 gamma. So yung 2 alpha class became another 2 gamma for a total of 4 gamma chains. So please copy. Okay, let's continue. Now let's talk about the abnormal hemoglobin pigments class. So the pigment in your blood is called hemoglobin. If this pigment is converted, it is no longer able to transport oxygen. Hypoxia and cyanosis may occur. Now, when you say pigment class, ito na yung mismong hemoglobin nyo. So abnormal hemoglobin. Kanina class, yung mga abnormalities na yun, they were somewhat related with the iron as well as the globin. Now this time yung buong pigment niya. So let's start with your carboxyhemoglobin. So this is hemoglobin in combination with carbon monoxide. They are found in the blood of tobacco smokers. So kung mahilig ka manigarilyo class, you would have a high concentration of this. Found in the blood of tobacco smokers at the concentration of 1 to 10%. Symptoms would include symptoms of poisoning class. Ang level niya would be 20 to 30%. It includes headache, nausea, dizziness, and muscular weakness. Then we have your methemoglobin. This is also known as hemoglobin and ferrihemoglobin. Hemoglobin, the ferric form class, unable to combine or transport oxygen. They are unable to combine with an oxygen molecule and replaced by a hydroxyl radical. So instead of oxygen class, ang kinocombine nila is this hydroxy radical. Now, this type of abnormal pigment can be acquired due to the exposure to drugs and chemicals such as nitrites, quinines, and chlorates. Now, it can also be inherited due to the structural abnormality of the globin chain. Can also be due to RBC enzyme defect in which methemoglobin form cannot be converted into the reduced form of hemoglobin. So, naalala niyo yung methemoglobin reductase pathway. Yan yun, class. Pag may abnormality ka, it would cause the creation of methemoglobin. Then we have your sulfhemoglobin. This is not normally found in the blood. When present, formation is irreversible. Remains for life in the red blood cell. Formed by certain drugs and chemicals such as your sulfonamide and aromatic amine. Can combine with carbon monoxide, forming your so-called carboxy sulfhemoglobin. Normal concentration is less than 1%. So please remember here, class, that the formation is irreversible. So please copy. Okay, let's continue. So this is the pathophysiology of your deoxygenation class. So kapag may mga abnormal hemoglobins ka, So this is the homozygous. Ito yung homozygous sickle cell. Ang HbS niya class, yung hemoglobin S niya sa blood is greater than 80%. Other cells could have 1 to 20% fetal hemoglobin or 2 to 5% HbA2. Clinical feature is that there would be 10 to 20% reticulocytosis. So you would see around 10 to 20% class ng mga reticulocytes. Then you have rare splenomegaly. So mag-enlarge yung spleen. But rarely lang naman. Then we have your sickle beta thalassemia. This is a hybrid class. Heterozygous naman to ng sickle cell. Sickle beta thalassemia. 60 to 90% are hemoglobin S. Variable yung content ng other cells. Ang feature niya, merong splenomegaly, microcytosis, and a 4 plus target cell. When you say 4 plus class, yan yung rating. And 4 plus is the highest, meaning sobrang dami. You would find abundant target cells. Then another one is yung heterozygous sickle cell SC, yung SC, hemoglobin SC class. Hemoglobin S is 45%. So 45% naman class would also be HBC. So 45% hemoglobin S, 45% hemoglobin C. 2 to 4% are A2 and 1% is hemoglobin F. Splenomegaly and again 4 plus sa target cell. Then we have yung heterozygous AS sickle trait or yung sickle trait na tinatawag natin. Hemoglobin S is 30 to 40%. Greater than 60% ang A1, slightly increased A2, and normal fetal hemoglobin. Clinical features is that there would be normal morphology, no splenomegaly. So, yan siya. So, please copy. Okay? Okay. Let's continue with this one class. So, ito pa yung other variants. So, here we have yung glutamic acid to valine for hemoglobin S, glutamic acid to lysine. So, yan. Yan sila class. So, I won't discuss them anymore isa-isa, but please try to memorize them. So, please copy. Okay, let's continue. Let's talk about your plasma hemoglobin class. Now, when you say plasma hemoglobin, this is the hemoglobin found in the plasma. So, most likely, if your hemoglobin is found in the plasma, your RBC class is already, your RBC has been lyse or nasira na sila. Now, it is also known as your free hemoglobin. Now, the normal values of your free hemoglobin class is 2 to 3 milligram per DL of plasma. Now, they can be increased. If it's 5 to 10 milligram per DL, ang itsura ng plasma nyo would appear as yellow-orange plasma. If it's greater than 10 milligram per DL, the appearance would be a pink plasma. If it's 25 to 39 milligram per DL, it indicates hemolytic anemia. Why hemolytic anemia, class? Because there is an increased RBC lysis. Continuous ang RBC lysis nyo in hemolytic anemia. And it would be greater than 40 milligram per DL if there is intravascular hemolysis, such as your hemolytic, HTR would stand for hemolytic transfusion reaction. Your PCH would stand for paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria. Hemoglobinuria. And your paroxysmal wait lang plus. Your paroxysmal ay, bakit? Paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria. Lahat yan, class, is capable of causing intravascular hemolysis. Hemolytic transfusion reaction, class, that would occur when there is incompatible blood type. Kung ang blood type mo is blood type A at sinalinan ka ng blood type B, yan ang mangyayari sa'yo. Now, itong paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria na to, class, this is caused by an antibody known as your IgM. It would attack your red blood cells and is characterized by hemoglobinuria. Kulay red yung urine nyo. And yung paroxysmal nocturnal would happen naman. Same lang din. It causes blood hemoglobin in the urine, but they would occur at night. Night yung kaya siya tinawag na nocturnal. Now, if you still remember, there's a plasma protein known as yung haptoglobin nyo. They bind to the free hemoglobin, can approximately combine with 3 grams of hemoglobin. Pag nag-bind siya sa hemoglobin, di ba, dadalhin niya sa liver. Then we have hemolytic anemia. Haptoglobin, hemoglobin complexes are rapidly removed, causing decreased haptoglobin. Haptoglobin as an acute phase reactant is increased in inflammation. So please copy. Okay, let's continue. Now, these are the tests for your plasma hemoglobin. Meron tayong tinatawag na spectroscopic detection, also known as your Shams test. The Shams test is a blood test that uses spectroscopy to determine significant levels of methamphetamine in the blood. A positive result would indicate intravascular hemolysis. When plasma hemoglobin is broken down, your B1 is increased. The heme fraction after hemoglobin breakdown will be bound to albumin and will become yung methemalbumin. When hemoglobin breaks down in the kidney, hemosiderin would appear in the urine. Yellow-brown granules will form within the tubular epithelial cells or CAS. Blue granules, which are positive for Prussian blue reaction, are also observed. Okay. Kapag meron kang class na when you have what we call intravascular hemolysis, you would have a positive test for this. Now, when you have intravascular hemolysis class, your plasma hemoglobin is abundant. Now, sa sobrang dami nila class, your haptoglobin cannot bind to all of them. Di ba naalala nyo? If na-drain na or naubos na yung haptoglobin nyo, the one that would replace it is your albumin. Now, what happens here in this case, when albumin binds with heme, it would be now known as methemalbumin. And there would also be an increased B1 or your indirect bilirubin. Now, when hemoglobin class is broken down in the kidney tubules, hemosiderin would appear in the urine. And there would be the presence of yellow-brown granules, which will form within the tubular epithelial cell or CAS. Now, yan sila. And then blue granules, which are positive for Prussian blue reaction, are also observed. So please copy. Okay, so this is the normal value class of your hemoglobin. So men would have 14 to 18 gram percent. Ang SI niya would be gram to liter. Women 12 to 16, women in late pregnancy 8.5 to 14, children 14 to 26. So for you to convert this to SI class, i-multiply nyo lang siya sa 10. So 140 to 80 gram per liter, 120 to 160 gram per liter, 85 to 140 gram per liter, 140 to 260 gram per liter. So please copy. Okay. So